I'd like to welcome Kathleen Liberty to our group. So again, Kathleen's an Associate Professor at Health Sciences at University, and she's done some really amazing research. It's all dear to our hearts about children who've been through our earthquakes here in Canterbury and the effects of post-traumatic stress on those children. So I'm not going to spend time with the introduction. I think you all saw the bio, but Kathleen's come to us from the States, so we're pleased that you're settled here and that you're going to be working with our community. So welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning. I'd like to thank all of you for giving up your time to come and listen to the presentation. I realize all of you have very challenging work environments. And what I found is in talking to other groups that when I talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the children in our study, it helps people understand that they're not alone in facing some of these challenging behaviors, whether they're parents or teachers, principals running schools, school nurses, counselors, psychologists, and so forth. And it is something I believe that's affected everyone across the community. And so I hope that the information I can give you today will maybe help you confirm your own beliefs and experiences and help you realize that you're really not alone in some of the challenges that our community is facing. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge really the contributions that have been made to our research by the children and parents, the teachers and the resource teachers of learning behavior from the 13 schools. I've been in Christchurch since 1990. Sadly, I did not seek the right speech language therapy so that I can sound like where my heart actually is. But during that time I've worked, I've had the privilege of working in more than 200 schools in Christchurch. And but I want to thank these particular schools for participating in the studies I'll be sharing with you today. Also, some of my colleagues from the University of Otago and the University of Canterbury who've helped me with my research. And one of my colleagues who died in the February earthquake. So I wanted to talk, first of all, about what types of trauma can produce post-traumatic stress symptoms. And first of all, of course, there's natural disasters. And there's many different types of natural disasters. I put some of them up here. But earthquakes are quite different from other natural disasters. First of all, because there is no warning. And there's not only no government warning or weather report that you might see if it's a hurricane, there is also no physical warning. So when a storm is coming and the sky gets dark, you have a kind of physiological warning that something is about to happen. When the water is rising and you can see that your body and can sense and see the changes in the environment, you have a kind of physiological warning that an event is about to happen, but we don't get those with earthquakes, as probably many of you know. And so that's one thing that sets earthquakes apart. Now, in New Zealand, the most common natural disaster is flooding, and we've seen a lot of flooding this year. And we've also had fires, so we've had both fires and flooding and earthquakes in Christchurch in the last 6 months. And there's a world disaster risk research group that's in Europe, and they've identified New Zealand as one of the top risk countries for natural disasters. So you can tourism. Yeah, so you can affirm yourself, affirm these feelings that it seems a bit much to have all this happening. But then, unfortunately, there's all these human-generated traumas as well. There's accidental ones, such as vehicle accidents that can cause near-death experiences and traumatic effects in children. There's illness, like having a parent die of cancer or have other very serious things. Children who have chronic illness, like severe asthma, which is one of my other research areas, can have symptoms of post-traumatic stress from the repeated fears associated, well, they believe it's from the repeated fears associated with not being able to breathe properly, or from repeated hospitalizations. And then there's non-accidental human-generated trauma, war, terrorism, maltreatment, and witnessing and experiencing violence. And so New Zealand has one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world, and that is probably, that in combination with the natural disasters, is why in the most recent report, although it's not very recent now, but the most recent World Health Organization report put New Zealand as the third, the country with the third highest rate of adult post-traumatic stress disorder in the world. Number 1, Northern Ireland. Number 2, the United States. Number 3, New Zealand. So we do live in a community, in a country in which many people can be affected by disasters and by human-generated events. And then we have the combinations of natural and human-generated events. And these are often, in terms of natural disasters, the events that follow on from the disaster. So people losing their jobs, schools being closed, communities being separated, and so forth. And in Japan, we had the meltdown or the damage to the nuclear reactor that followed the tsunami. And that's another combination of a man-made malfunction and a natural disaster. And so even though we are very much focused on, in our research, on the effects on children of a series of earthquakes, the types of symptoms and so forth that you see in children can be associated with other types of traumatic events and combinations of events. So we hear repeatedly, or I hear repeatedly from the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, that there's children like this all over the country, and I agree, there are children all over the country, even ones who weren't here during the earthquakes. During a disaster situation, children have needs that are very different from adults. Young children particularly, they may not be able to escape danger. They're not used to running off on their own or getting under desks. They may be separated from their parent and family, and certainly we saw that in the big February earthquake in which many children were at school or preschool. And they may not have the language or the competence to identify who they are, to talk about their feelings, or to understand the events around them. They won't be able to make critical decisions by virtue of their young age, but they still may experience events that would even tax adults to try and understand and make sense of. And one of the key factors that influences what happens in a post-disaster environment is the length of time of the disaster environment. And this is something that makes the earthquake situation that we started experiencing in September 4th, 2010, so unique. Because between that period of time and the middle of June 2012, we realized we had around 14,000 aftershocks. We had more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or greater. And the evidence being published from our School of Geological Sciences indicates there has been no record in the published literature or in the data taking of any earthquake sequence like that. It's very unique. The other thing that made it so unique is that many of the earthquakes were very shallow. So the amount of damage to systems, our sewer systems, our water systems, electricity, and so forth, our road networks, our hospitals, the infrastructure of our community buildings and our schools, the damage was way more extensive, especially in a first world type country as compared to, say, a country like Haiti, where they didn't have strong building standards And so we did experience a very unique type of series of events. And one of the things to think about from a child's point of view is that, especially the children in our study who were just developing their conception of the world, that their experience of the world is transformed in basically a few instants. In our case, it was a much longer period of time, but the massive amounts of destruction were really from 4 major earthquakes, particularly the quake in February of 2011. And so it's difficult enough for adults to make sense of how their world changed. And it's almost impossible to imagine that very young children who haven't developed language competence or reached the cognitive stage of being able to understand chance events could actually comprehend and make sense of what they experienced. One important thing that we have learned in our research and our review of the literature is how important the events that come after a disaster are in terms of the development of symptoms. And following both the 9/11 terrorism attack in New York City and Hurricane Katrina, there's been an upsurge of research. We were in some ways fortunate, I guess, that those events took place in areas that were dense with research competent universities, and a huge amount of learning has come out from that. And we are learning more and more how these factors, not just the initial trauma, but what happens not only in the individual or their family, but also in the community, can affect the development of children after, in the post-disaster period. And in fact, now there's an app you can download called Psychological First Aid. It's you can put it on your smartphone. I have it online. So it's for first responders, to help first responders figure out how the best way to respond to promote good mental health following a disaster. So some of the effects of disaster on children, it may affect their emotion regulatory system. So their HPA axis can become disrupted from repeated experiences of fear. So when you feel an earthquake, you probably feel your heart might speed up, and then you can have your prefrontal cortex send a signal down saying, no, we're in a safe environment, it's all right. Or it might say things like, it's a truck, it's wind, right? But these are not types of skills at emotional regulation that young children had developed. So we find in the biological psychiatric literature that these are the places in the brain where the most disruption is likely to occur. And when you combine that with the fact that children are in a neurologically developmentally sensitive period, you can see that there is a possibility that these impacts could disrupt their normal developmental progression. We also believe that children at the age of our study children, which is younger than 4 in September of 2010, they're developing their view of the world. And the very young children were developing the idea of object permanence, if you cast your mind back to those early cognitive developmental stages. And so what they experienced was the world all of a sudden shaking, things falling down off the walls, electricity going off and on, water being drinkable or not, using a toilet or a portaloo if they were at that stage of development, and so forth. So their idea of the world is not one where things are permanent. It's where things can be shaken about at any time. And so this has affected also their ability to develop self-regulation. The children also, according to the literature, would have an over-perception of negativity in events. because they have heightened fear responses. And research indicates that children can experience a delay in their development at around 2 years. And so you've probably been aware of the reports over the last few years of children coming to school who weren't toilet trained. And when the normal expectation might be that they would be toilet trained, or at least most of them by the time they were 5. Recently, a friend of mine, last year actually, went on a school camp with 10-year-olds. And the first night in school in the camp, every child in that cabin left their bed. So this was not an experience that people had previously before the earthquake. So it is something that is associated with the kinds of impacts of trauma. You also have a form of developmental regression where the children who might have developed some competence begin acting as if they were their younger selves. So even though they might have been starting school and going along quite well, they become more clingy and cry, or they become withdrawn and so forth. So these are the types of impacts that have been identified in the research literature about how disaster impacts children. So there are different mental health pathways that have been identified. Top one is post-traumatic growth. So this graph shows on the vertical axis the adaptive functioning levels, and on the horizontal axis time, and on the vertical axis the adaptive functioning. And so this graph is just dealing with people who were in normal functioning prior to the onset of a traumatic event, and then describing different mental health pathways. Post-traumatic growth, there's some controversy over this now, that people now believe that you have to experience the lows before you can have post-traumatic growth. But that was the idea, that some people functioning is improved post-disaster. They recognize strengths and capabilities in themselves they didn't know they had before. Stress resistance is people who to all intents and purposes appear to be unaffected by the trauma. They seem to be functioning about the same as they were before. Pathway B is the resilience or bounce back pathway. So following the traumatic event, there is some loss of functioning, some difficulty coping, perhaps some maladaptive behaviors, and then rising back up. This would actually rise up to be on top of A, but they didn't draw it that way because it was too confusing in terms of a diagram. So that's a resilience bounce back idea. And then we have 2 categories of persistent maladaptive functioning that are identified as post-traumatic stress. There's the delayed onset and the onset within 2 months. So that's right when you have a decline in functioning. You don't have recovery. You don't have bounce back. And so that is the typical identification of patterns for post-disaster mental health pathways. So taking a look at post-traumatic stress disorder, the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder was for children and for adults was revised in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition in 2013. And so it was revised really for children based on the fact that children don't have the same wide range of abilities and experiences and coping strategies and so forth that adults have. And it's been divided really in 2 parts, one for children 6 and younger, and one for older than 6. I think I don't know why they chose age 6, except for I expect it's because it's the age that children start kindergarten in the United States, but I'm not sure. But so the criteria, they have taken post-traumatic stress disorder out of the anxiety disorder. And this is because the clusters of symptoms include behaviors that don't really map on to anxiety disorders. And so this includes things particularly like aroused one reactivity, which is their third symptom cluster. So these would be children who are irritable, have angry meltdowns, might be oppositional and defiant, and have nightmares, have hyper. Sound familiar? Yes. And so there are also symptoms that are similar to anxiety and depression. This is negative moods, being more cryy and clingy, and perhaps really never being very cheerful. And then we have a cluster of symptoms around intrusion. And so intrusion is children who have difficulty paying attention. They might seem paying attention one moment and the next they don't. They have difficulty sleeping and difficulties with other types of repetitive behaviors in classrooms. So those are the main symptom clusters, and they've also taken the dissociation subtype. So some children, not so much, we don't believe with natural disasters, but with maltreatment, especially with maltreatment by the parents, the children's emotions can become disassociated, and so they appear callous and uncaring. And so really it's their form of protecting themselves against the events. And they've learned perhaps that the best way to get along with a parent who's abusing them is to appear to show no emotion. So we have seen that in some of our children in our study. We have children, I was in the lobby or entrance area of a school waiting to see that one of the principals in our study, and these three girls came in their pinafores off the playground. And so the school secretary looked at them and said, "Can I help you or something?" And they're just standing there, and they've been waiting because it was quite crowded after lunch. And this one little girl, she was about 6, said she's hurt herself, and pointed to the little girl in the middle, and show me. And she turned around and lifted up her pinafore, and her whole leg was covered in blood. And she had had some horrible fall. And she wasn't crying, she was completely expressionless. And so it was quite shocking, and she was sent to the nurse's office and so on. But we've also heard a teacher tell us about a little boy who came to school and said, "My dog was run over. My dog was run over, my puppy." And the teacher said something about, "Oh, that's terrible," or "How awful." And he said, "Oh, well, we'll just get another one." So there's like no expression on the face. So we do know there are children that have disassociation. And we can pick up some of that in our data, but we do see a lot more of children with other types of symptoms as well. The research indicates that there will be a persistent problem with developmental and learning problems, and this has been in Hurricane Katrina. They had increased developmental and learning problems, and and also emotional problems. Now, the study we're conducting, as I mentioned before, is about young children, and so we couldn't find anything in the literature about children that were that young. So these are based on older children. So just to put the earthquakes again in a different perspective, Hurricane Katrina, which we've heard about and is a very well-studied disaster, the rate of injury is 9.8 per 10,000 and deaths 3.1 for 10,000. I've put the pre-disaster poverty levels there because that's associated with the development of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. You can see that our injury rate from the Canterbury earthquakes, primarily the February earthquake, and our death rate is higher than Hurricane Katrina. So that's something that people don't recognize, was more severe impact. And of course, to put our experiences in perspective, then we can see that the Japanese earthquake and tsunami that occurred shortly after our February earthquake had again a much higher death rate and injury rate as well. So my colleagues and I had conducted a study funded by the Asthma Foundation looking at the health of children as they started school and how this impacted on their achievement, with a particular focus on asthma. And Philip Padamore and Jim Reed from the University of Otago, I think Philip's in the hospital here, they were my colleagues on this particular study. And what we realized later was that the data we collected from teachers and parents in this particular study could be used as a baseline comparison against the children who had experienced the earthquake. So these children, we had 298 children. They entered 8 schools that we randomly selected. And these children were born between 2001 and 2002, and the study was conducted between 2006 and 2008. And so following, I think, the earthquakes, I was having a meeting with my colleague Maureen Allen, so I'd like to introduce Maureen now. Maureen is the manager of the T4 cluster and of resource teachers of learning and behavior. And Maureen and I were talking about a study that one of my students was going to conduct with children with autism, and she happened to mention that the 5-year-olds coming into school in the second part of 2012 were showing completely different behaviors than they had, and this was coming to the attention of many schools. And later, through a series of conversations, we realized that we could actually use the data from this baseline study, collect some more data and compare it, and see if actually there were some differences, and if there were, perhaps we could use these data to leverage some additional support for schools. So our current study began in 2013, and these were children that were born between 2007 and 2010. I actually think now we have a few children that were born in 2011, but that was a surprise. And so these children, the children in our study, were here or in utero in September of 2010, and they're here straight through, right? So we don't have children who moved here after the earthquakes, although those children are in the schools. They're not in our particular study. And we actually have 322 children now, but of those, the 308 experienced all 4 of those major earthquakes and were here that whole time. So we have children from schools on the east and south side of Christchurch. And by chance, of those 8 schools in our previous study, 6 were from the east and south side of Christchurch. So it does make it a easier comparison. So we collected information from the parents of the children in the earthquake-exposed group. And this is just some of the exposure information. 2% of the study children were injured. 9.8% knew someone in their family or close to them that was injured or died. 66% of them, parents reported that the house they lived in was damaged, and over 80% experienced that objects falling. We have information on around 14% used a portaloo for more than 1 month. Around 10% of our families received counseling, and about 51%, 52% experienced high levels of stress. Although we realized later that this was a really bad question because parents wrote all these notes, and they wrote, well, it was really stressful, but it was nothing like what happened to,
my niece or our neighbors. And so they ticked no, they didn't experience stress. And some people wrote, well, our house wasn't really damaged very much. And so I put no. So, of course, we know that that's the way Kiwis respond, right? And so they can make do and they can see that their experiences may not have been as bad as someone else. So I have to take some of this, I accept the first few, but the bottom few I think maybe not quite too accurate. So what we found is we asked teachers when the children started school to rate their behaviors, and we gave them about 30 behaviors to rate the child on, of which we were particularly interested in the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Our teachers didn't actually know which ones were the symptoms. So this is data from a study that we published last year. It's freely available to anyone. So you can it's published in this journal. It's an online journal. And so we have tried to make a commitment to publish all our research in freely available things. But in this particular study, we looked at comparing the pre-earthquake group and the post-earthquake group with the symptoms they had when they started school. And in our pre-earthquake group, around 40% of the children had 0 symptoms. And in our post-earthquake group, around 29% had 0 symptoms. So that kind of means that the children who are available to model really good behaviors, to be the ones that the teachers can look to, that was really significantly reduced. We also looked at the children who had 6 or more symptoms. We checked this against the DSM, so this is not, these are not children that are identified by a psychiatrist. Like most post-disaster environments, there aren't enough psychiatrists to go around diagnosing a community sample of children for a study. And so we saw in the pre-earthquake group, 8.8% of the children had 6 or more symptoms. In our post-earthquake group, around 21%. And when we estimated the DSM criteria, which was accepted by our peer review for our study, we had very similar rates. So we were thinking around, if we have 20% of the children that have high symptoms and 30% of the children that have no symptoms, that leaves 50% of the children with some symptoms. And so this was our first look at the children. We've been following the children. Now, in our study, we followed the children for 3 years. So this is some more information about the children's learning. So these are the percent of children who are not meeting the national standards. So it's a little different than the data that Professor Gillen presented. So the orange bar indicates what the national rate is of failure, and the colored bars indicate the rates of failure that we're seeing. So after 40 weeks is the children after 1 year in school, after 2 years in school, and after 3 years of school. These are 3 distinct groups of children. These are not the same children. Because of course, once someone falls behind in year 1, the chances are they might be behind in year 2. So we can see that the rates of failure on the national standards in reading, writing, and math are much higher than normal. And we should say that our schools we have 2 high decile schools, 2 mid decile schools, and a low decile school. And so these are very concerning to the schools. The difference in the children's behavior is very concerning. And we did collect additional information from the parents about some of the children's somatic symptoms. So we can also compare these data with our pre-earthquake children, and we can see much higher rates of sleep problems and of the somatic symptoms that are associated with stress and persistent stress. Now, we're not saying that all these symptoms that we're seeing are just the result of the earthquakes, because as I mentioned before, we have the post-disaster factors as well. Plus, many of these children will have experienced events in their families. 2 of the schools were flooded in the second year of the study. Some of the homes now have been, the parents were right on the border of some of those bushfires in the Port Hills. So we know that we are also seeing the cumulative effects of trauma. And we do know that trauma does accumulate across the lifetime, and that's what contributes to adult mental health problems. So I think the research indicates if a child has experienced 3 or 4 serious traumatic events by the time they're 35 years of age, they have almost triple the risk of a mental health disorder in adulthood. So one of our concerns, of course, is we have a whole cohort of children who all experienced at least one traumatic event. And whether or not that affected them, that initial event affected them, we do know from the research that it does make them more vulnerable to developing post-traumatic stress symptoms after subsequent events. So, just to repeat, post-traumatic stress disorder is no longer an anxiety disorder, and so the symptoms cut across the traditional groupings of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Children have attention problems, they have high activity levels, and they have impulsive behaviors. Conduct disorder, children can have symptoms of anger and defiance, of aggressive behaviors, and mood disorders, anxiety and depressive disorders. And some adults will develop those particular be diagnosed, or even teenagers diagnosed with those particular disorders. You usually in a community get higher rates of diagnosis of ADHD and conduct disorder in children. This is because the clinicians don't have experience with diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder in huge numbers of children. There's not treatment pathways, there's not clinician training. This is very, very common in post-disaster communities. The other thing that you have is if you have a child who develops post-traumatic stress symptoms because of, say, a terrible automobile accident or a near-death experience from asthma attack, you have the family, whānau, and community resources to come in to help that child and to support the family. But when a whole community is affected by disaster, there's not enough of those resources to go around to everyone who could use that kind of support. So you have a community that wants to help, and they often look to treatments that have been used with other things, like treatments for ADHD, like methylphenidate, or treatments for conduct disorder, such as Incredible Year